day, I was sitting on my deck watching the leaves go back and forth and sipping a cup of coffee. I was thinking, how lucky was I? I had a great life, a great job, the kids were a little older, and now it was really finally time for me. I had my whole life planned out as to what it was going to look like. A whole new chapter of my life was about to begin. In fact, it was going to begin the next day. The family had been packing in order to go to the lake. We'd spent all winter in Columbus, Ohio, in the cold and the dark, and we were so excited to go to the lake on the next day. I had done just what you guys do. You clean the house, you pack the bags, you do the laundry, you mow the yard, but it was all going to be worth it to leave the next day. I had a grant that was due for work, so I finally put down my cup of coffee and went back to the computer, and I was clicking away when the phone rang. And this is what I heard. "Are you Herman's daughter?" the voice on the other end said. I said, "Yes, it is." "Oh, we're with your father. We're the police. Do you know, Mrs. McVicker, that your father has been sending money to Canada? He's been wiring money over the last several days to Canada." I was stunned to learn that my father had been told he'd won the Canadian lottery, and he'd been sending the taxes to Canada. He had sent $68,000 to Canada to pay for the taxes. Now this was sort of interesting. How had my father gotten to the bank to do that? My father had macular degeneration and hadn't driven in years. The furthest he ever walked was to the post box at the end of the driveway. Yet he walked the 10 blocks to his neighborhood bank to do this. The other thing that was kind of interesting is that as my sister and I were growing up, if we said to my father, "Can we have an ice cream cone?" he would tell us that we were selfish and that money was tight in our family. So here was a very bright, frugal man who had just sent $68,000 to Canada. Yeah, a whole new chapter of my life was beginning, one for which I was totally unprepared, one for which I really didn't want that role reversal, one in which I was now taking care of my parents. I was in the sandwich generation, stuck in the middle of kids, career, and now taking care of elderly parents. The next day was not spent basking on a raft in the lake. It was spent in Columbus closing up all their bank accounts, making certain they were going to be safe, making certain they had some cash under their bed in case they needed something. I finally did leave with my family some days later to go to the lake. During that 8-hour drive, I was so tired, so overwhelmed, and so fragile that I sobbed quietly in the back of the car the whole way, thinking, how did we get in such a mess? Now, in all honesty, and because you're all my friends, I'm going to be honest with you, I was angry. I was angry at my parents. I was angry because I told them about scams. There was stuff on TV all the time, so I was telling them about it. I told them not to answer the door. I tried to keep them safe. I put an answering machine on their phone and said every night as I left work and stopped at their house every night, that we would listen to those answering machine together and decide which ones were worth returning. But they hadn't followed this. They hadn't stayed safe. And yet there were 2 really capable parents. But you know who I was really angry with? I was really angry at myself. I had not been paying attention. I hadn't gotten prepared. I hadn't gotten any essential information about this next part of my life. I don't know about you guys, but as you were raising kids, I'm going to bet you had a stack of books this high next to your bedstand. You knew everything there was to know about a 2-year-old, and you knew about 13-year-old boys. But you read all this stuff, so you got essential information. You probably also joined a play group or the PTA, so you had emotional support. So you were getting good information all along, and you had an emotional support system. I had none of those. I also hadn't been paying attention. I hadn't opened that top drawer to see their checkbook and realize it hadn't been balanced, or where they were writing checks to these places in foreign countries. I hadn't paid attention that they weren't really getting up as early in the morning, or bathing quite as often, or that maybe the food in the back of the refrigerator had mold. So I hadn't been paying attention. So what I want to do tonight for you all is to get you ready before the crisis. There is going to be a crisis. You are going to get that phone call. Now, it may not be like mine, that somebody got scammed, but it could be that mom's fallen, she's in the ER at Riverside, come quickly. So I want you to have the essential information and the emotional support to be ready before the crisis. So my question to you is, are you ready? Are you ready? So tonight, we're going to do a couple different things. First of all, if I can get you sooner than later to do something, I will have felt as though the whole evening together was great. I want you to know that information is powerful. I think when you're in the middle of a crisis, if you feel you've got some information, you feel a little more steady on your feet. So I want to give you information. There are caregiver challenges, but there's also some cures. To recognize both and how to get there. And then to have some strategies going forward. This is my family. Nice looking family. I'm depending upon Social Security and the government to take care of me. If that doesn't work, don't laugh so loud. If that doesn't work, my backup plan is my family. Well, let's talk about my family. First of all, in the middle of the back is Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob now follows me around and videotapes me, and he does quite a nice job. I also tell stories on Dr. Bob throughout the evening, and I can do that for two reasons. Number one is he's a great guy, and everybody loves him. And secondly, he gave me permission to do that. On this side is my daughter, who lives in Madison, Wisconsin, with her husband and her little boy. Madison, Wisconsin is a little trip away from Columbus, Ohio. But more than that is, she lives around the corner from her in-laws. She's going to be taking care of her in-laws. Then the nice-looking guy on the far side, 31 years old, unmarried, living in San Francisco as a bond trader. I'm not counting on him. I'm just not going to count on him. So as we talk about who's going to care for us, I think we got to come up with another plan. Now, a lot of caregiving is in fact done by families. 85% of the on-hands care is done by families. So my thought is that I should have had more kids. I just didn't plan this right. But the other part of that is, you're laughing about the federal government, is that about $450 billion a year are saved out of the national budget of having to take care of elderly because the adult child is taking care of mom and dad. So they haven't counted that in the budget. What happens to all of us when we're not there to take care of mom and dad? So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So I was stuck in the middle of taking care of my kids, a career, and my parents. And I started a list about the things I was going to do better. And in fact, I feel this is the #1 thing pushing the sandwich generation to get their own lives organized, is because we don't want to do this to our kids. We want to be prepared, we want to have the papers, we want to be proactive. And so one of the things was, I started this list. I was going to get up every day and take a shower. I was going to, when my kids say it's time to quit driving, I was going to, with a smile, hand over my keys. I was going to stay social. I was going to move earlier instead of later. So I had this whole long list. It was on my computer. I had it notarized and laminated. And I gave it to my kids. And I said, when I get out of control and you can't get me back into control, you hand this up to me and say, Mom, you signed this and said you were willingly going to do this. So that's how the book started. But then, and you can have me back someday to talk to you about publishing a book. That's a whole nother 1 hour story about that. I will tell you this, don't quit your day job. You're never going to pay even the electricity off of a book. But it was something that I did with my daughter, and I did it because I felt that it filled a need. And since then I've been doing more and more writing and more speaking. And I work a lot with corporations because 2/3 of the adult children are in the workplace. You don't have time to come out and hear me speak at night. You need me in the workplace. You need me doing lunch and learns. We need to get that information and emotional support into the workplace. So that's become a big push for me right now. Okay, so how many of you are caregiving right now? Raise your hand. First of all, everybody, let's give them a round of applause. Oh, wow. And, you know, sometimes there's not many Hallmark moments. Sometimes there aren't many thank yous or hugs. So I want you to know the rest of us really know what you're going through and we understand it. Okay, put your hands back up. How many of you are caregiving right now? How many of you keep your hands up. How many of you had caregiven in the past? How many of you think you're going to caregive in the future? Now, if you'd all kept your hands up, how many of you know somebody that's caregiving? How many of you have parents? You're all going to do this in some direct or indirect way. You are going to become a caregiver. So as I've been out talking across the country, one of the things I've realized is that people don't have caregiving thought of as this whole long-term event going on. They think of it as a crisis and things will be okay and tomorrow we'll get through that crisis and on to the next thing. So I want to find a visual way to get people to realize how long this is. Do you realize you could care for your parents as long as you cared for your kids? Sometimes there's gasps, sometimes there's tears as I say that. So this is what I came up with as a visual. I think what happens is we kind of start to have the realization that something's going on with Mom and Dad. I heard a couple of you share that on your way in. Things are just starting to fall apart. Just a few of the ADLs, acts of daily living, are starting to fall off of the table. But maybe you don't have to do anything yet. This is where I want you to start caregiving one-on-one. This is where I want you to start to get the information. Collect things from Mom and Dad, get a plan in place, get your siblings on board. But we're not doing that. Almost to the person, we wait for the crisis. We wait for the phone call. Do you realize that 85% of long-term care solutions are planned at the bedside during a crisis? That's not great planning, guys. That's just not the way to do it. So we're always working out a caregiving 911. Now, realization may be some months or years. Crisis may be some months. But this is the part we're really not talking about. These long, fragile years. The years in which one more active daily living falls off. Now, for those of you that don't know what that term is, I just want to tell you two terms so when you're out and about, you can fling these words around. Maybe over the water cooler tomorrow at work. There's basic acts of daily living. It's exactly what it says, basic. You know, can they feed themselves? Can they toilet? Those kinds of things. And then there's the, I'm having a senior moment. Somebody help me when it's the higher order thinking. I can't believe I've just, instrumental, is that the word?
Advanced.
Well, I'll think of it. Sometime when I'm on a different PowerPoint, I'm going to come out with it. Instrumental acts of daily living, and that's just a higher order thinking. That's paying the bills, making a doctor's appointment, actually making it to the doctor's appointment, taking the meds correctly. All these things can start to fall off the table and all of a sudden you and your siblings are realizing, we've got to do something. That could be 10 years when you think about it. End of life, again, we don't talk much about preparing for end of life, but we really should. We should be talking to mom and dad about what they want. We should also be preparing that that's going to happen sooner or later. And this is where we really don't have much support. During mourning, who are you now if you've been a caregiver for all that time? How do you define yourself? What's ahead of you? What do you do with all that free time? What do you do when the generation above you is gone? Mourning takes as long as it takes. Some people talk about 3 years. Kubler-Ross talked about the stages and how you bounce back and forth between all the stages. It really does. It just takes as long as it takes. But as you're looking at this, this is a whole hunk of your life. So, as I said, I'm going to yell at you over and over again tonight. Start tonight. In fact, at the end of the program, I'm going to give you have a sheet of paper there, and I'm going to see if I can get you to do anything in terms of what you're going to start as soon as you go home tonight. Trying to get out of Caregiving 911 and into Caregiving 101 really talks about when you start to have these conversations. And nationally right now there's kind of some discussion about when you as an adult child caregiver is 40 and mom and dad are 70. How many of you are already late to the table? Yeah, I'm betting a lot of people, we wait till maybe we're 60 and mom and dad are 80 or so to have the conversation. We're waiting too long. Because in those years, all of a sudden you could be planning that mom's going to be there to talk to her, but physically or mentally maybe she won't be. You can't afford to wait. You have to do it sooner. So I kind of talk to my audiences about when your kids leave for college. That's when, now that generation is off to college, that's when you start having conversations with mom and dad. What's the future going to look like? So there are challenges for the caregivers. Unprepared, definitely unprepared. I bet most of you don't have a stack of books on your night table about taking care of elderly parents. We're very fortunate. When I first started this, there weren't a whole bunch of books. There weren't a whole bunch of websites. There's enough really great stuff out there now that you can, in fact, get good information, even at midnight. My problem was working. It was like support group. Everybody said, oh, Barb, take care of yourself. You know, you've got to take care of the caregiver. And I'm like, okay, it's now midnight. I have on my fluffy slippers, and you're telling me to join a support group? Well, now there's virtual support groups. As I said, I've been working more and more with Fortune 500 companies doing things in the workplace. And one of the things that I do is every month I do a different topic as a webinar, and people are at their desks when the PowerPoint, the WebEx is going, and I'm talking, and the PowerPoint's going through. And I finally suggested to these companies that I institute a virtual support group. I wasn't certain it was going to work. I thought, do people have to be face-to-face to make that work? Well, it's the highest rated programming that they have. People so much need to be able to talk to other people and hear their stories and gain tips and go, oh my gosh, you're having the same problem with your siblings that I'm having with mine. It works very well because there's no safe place. And I think partly we are in an economic situation. We're talking in the workplace about being overwhelmed, trying to keep all the plates in the air, being tired, being distracted. You feel there's not a safe place to share that. So when you're doing it virtually, nobody knows who you are, where you are, what company you're with. So people are trying to get prepared, but they don't understand all the physical, financial, and emotional challenges. Physical, just from the standpoint of physically being there or physically taking over all the chores with mom and dad. My sister was just recently caring for a friend of hers who was dying from a brain cancer, and she was helping her to get into the bathtub. And in so doing, my sister heard a pop in the back of her back, and she ended up with a broken, fractured back. So we can, out of the goodness of our hearts, be trying to do stuff, but there's a whole physical aspect of this. And in fact, caregivers really need to be trained how to help transfer body weights. But we don't think about that. It just doesn't even come into our realm. Financial, definitely. The national average is that adult children supplement their parents yearly at $6,000. So if that's kind of across the board, you know, some people are supplementing at $20,000 and at other levels. So there's definitely a financial impact. There's also just the financial impact of getting, if you're long distance, getting to mom and dad. And then definitely the emotional challenges. We'll talk about that in a moment. Long distance. Now, those of us that were in town kept thinking that the out-of-town sibling was the lucky one, right? But I think there's a lot of stress on the long-distance caregiver, and particularly if you are the main caregiver. How do you really know what's going on with mom and dad? Is a phone call on Sunday night enough? Should I have been there one more time? Who should I have hired in? Why is dad's health going down as he's taking care of mom? So you don't know that long distance. I think there's a lot of stress involved with that. No support system, as we were talking about. Where do you go talk to people about diapering dad? It isn't so cool at a cocktail party. Uninformed, definitely struggle with work-life balance. Where does the time come from? I was interviewed by somebody on TV and they said, so where do you think the caregiver's time? You know, if they've got all this going on, I'm saying, sleep, exercise, socializing, reading a good book, they all fall off the table. There isn't any time for it. I was trying to figure out how you would know if you were a caregiver, and I could just look into your eyes and see bags under them, or I could see that you have your bag packed all the time, ready to go. But I decided, well, when you ask why the mailbox at the end of the driveway is knocked over and your mom says, the wind, that gives you a clue you're falling into caregiving. Or you find yourself thinking that visits to the bathroom is the only me time you get. It's almost like when we had 2-year-olds, right? Or when your mom's pharmacist sees you so often that she's now befriended you on Facebook. Or that everyone around the meeting table at work are sharing where they went on their vacation. And your boss pulls out pictures of Italy. You pull out pictures of your mother's retirement center and the bingo prize that she won.